How's it going, folks? I'm Matthew. This is Lemora's Cards, and today we're making a cEDH guide for 2025. Your guide to some of the most popular decks, staples, the archetypes of the format, what to expect getting into the game right now. As of this recording, the last really big shakeup was the commander bans that took away Dockside Extortionist, Mana Crypt, Jewel Lotus, and Nadu, and the entire format has been incredibly shaken up since then, and we've got a little bit of time in our first really large event since then to sort of see what things start to establish, and we kind of have enough info now to at least have some idea of what the metagame looks like and what you should expect to see, and the main players that you need to know about if you're looking to get into this format or start playing in more events. If you enjoy this video, like, comment, subscribe, let me know down below which of these decks you're most interested in, what you're currently playing, or what you want to learn about. This isn't going to be exhaustive. I'm going to do a follow-up on this fairly soon. Right now the metagame is pretty open, but there are a few more that I really would like to touch on, namely Magda. You know, there's so much to talk about, it's a little beyond the scope of one video, but let me know what else you would like to hear about. Thank you as always to my amazing patrons over on Patreon, whose support helps me make cool stuff like this. If you want to learn more about cEDH, get some one-on-one time with me to learn more about it, patreon.com/Lemora'sCards in the description below. Check that out. With all that being said though, let's go ahead and hop into it. So if you're entirely, completely brand new, and don't know literally anything about cEDH, this video will help you. You may want to check out the beginning of my 2024 guide to cEDH, where I go over a little bit more about some of the archetypes and some of the staples. Because things have changed so much, it's going to be hard for me to devote time to every staple and explaining all of them in as much detail as I have in previous videos. But this will still be an overview on a lot of the most popular cards, especially cards that are seeing more play now that didn't see quite as much play before the bans, and talking about the overall changes and really trying to get you up to date on cEDH and hopefully either give you an idea of what you want to play or a better understanding of the format so you know what to combat. So first up, we're going to be talking about Tymna Thrasios, and we're going to be taking a look at the Tymna Thras deck list that won the Boil 2. For choosing these deck lists, I tried to highlight lists that top 16 very recently, and if I could, stuck to sort of the core of what those decks usually are. Kind of had a preference for decks that didn't have as much hot tech and were more representative of what those decks tend to look like. And I'll give you some ideas of other builds that you could take a look at or some things that aren't in these lists that you might want to see. In the post-ban metagame, the popular deck to beat, it seems, is Tymna Thrasios. Tymna Kraum was the most popular deck for a while, and we're still going to talk about that one. But for now, this is the deck to beat. Tymna Thrasios is 4 colors, sans red. You have access to 2 fairly decent engines in the command zone. Neither of them are quite as powerful as Kraum was with Jewel Lotus and Dockside and Mana Crypt in the format, but they both represent different ways to get advantage and also have their own sort of unique things about them, right? Thrasios isn't the best rate for gaining advantage, spending 4 mana to get 1 card out of him. The thing that he allows you to do though is hold up your mana to interact. These decks tend to be very interactive. And the other thing he allows you to do is spend infinite mana to draw your entire deck, which is kind of the main draw to him. I think Tymna Thras tends to not use Thrasios as their main engine very often, outside of when it's paired with a couple other cards that we'll talk about. But using him as an outlet is often one of the like safer ways that they can go for a win, because their other combos are a little bit more all in. It also has like a lot of the most overlap. So you can just deploy him, use him as an engine for a little bit, draw some cards, get some lands into play, and then set up an infinite mana combo, pour all your mana into him, draw your entire deck, have as much protection as possible, and win with the Thras' Oracle. Tymna is kind of like the cEDH commander, gotten a little bit worse, I think, in general, but allows you to draw up to 3 cards if you can hit 3 of your opponents, paying life. One thing that has sort of changed Tymna is the prevalence of Orcish Bowmasters, and it's changed decks in general. This card has really changed the value of drawing cards and of your creatures. Fortunately, the way Tymna works is they have to respond first before you choose to draw the cards, so that lines up fine. Tymna really kind of lets you get value out of playing early creatures. You could go, you know, turn 1 Mana Dork, turn 2 Thrasios, and a turn 3 Tymna is drawing you, decently likely to draw you 2 cards. Decks really aren't built to take advantage of Tymna that much at the moment. You see a few slots that might be different based on whether you have Tymna or not, but we don't really see like a lot of flyers or evasive threats kind of be prioritized anymore. But Tymna is just a decent engine that comes down at an okay rate, but really just gives you access to white and black, which really help clean this list up. So the creatures, Tymna Thrasios decks will have some number of mana dorks. This list opting for 4 1-mana dorks. I've seen lists that run the 1-mana green dorks like Elvish Mystics, Llanowar Elves, things like that. So that won't be too uncommon to see 4 to 6 dorks, I think, on the average. I've seen maybe as high as 8. And then you might see some at the 2 mana values like Bloom Tinder, which is a big mana dork that can make you up to 4, potentially 5 mana in this deck if you can steal somebody's stuff or copy something. Devoted Druid, which is a mana dork, but it's also a combo piece that we'll talk about. So you'll see mana production in the low CMC slots, advantage engines like Esper Sentinel, which are insane staples in this format. Drawing cards off of your opponent's game actions is one of the most powerful things you can do because you have lots of opponents. Archivist of Ogma is in a similar boat to that. Draws cards when your opponents search their decks, which happens a lot in this format. Polywog Prodigy doing a similar thing to Archivist of Ogma, which is 2 mana, has Evolve, 1/3. When opponent casts a non-creature spell, mana value less than his power, draw a card. So at the base rate, when they cast zeros, you draw. But as you play more and more creatures that are larger than Polywog, you'll be able to buff him up and draw off of potentially like everything your opponent's cast if he gets large enough. Kinnan Bonder Prodigy makes extra mana when we tap things for mana that aren't lands. You know, our mana dorks, our rocks. Also pairs with Basalt Monolith to get infinite mana. Not every TNT runs that. Some of them find that card to be a little clunky, but typically if you see a Kinnan or just a Thrasios deck in general, you can kind of expect that there's a Kinnan and very likely to be a Basalt Monolith to generate infinite mana. You pump into that Thrasios to win. Lotho is a very popular advantage engine in these colors as well. Orcish Bowmasters, like I mentioned, this format is all about draw engines. You can see we have 2 of them in our command zone, and we're playing one of the most popular partner pairings, and the other most popular one, also both of them draw cards. So Orcish Bowmasters is allowing us to punish our opponent's draws. Not usually trying to punish their life totals, but mainly trying to keep them from developing mana sources, which is especially a big thing as green is more popular. And being able to do something like ping somebody's Bloom Tinder is a massive blowout where they're losing potentially like 4 or 5 mana. And in some decks, Bloom Tinder also being a combo piece. Being able to flash in an Orcish Bowmasters in response to some kind of draw effect like a Rhystic Study trigger, Esper Sentinel, or especially a wheel effect where the entire table is drawing, that can just win you the game outright. Bowmasters is a very warping card in the format, one of the most warping creatures in a lot of games, kind of depending on what the game is about, but especially as the game becomes more and more creature based. Thassa's Oracle, you probably know this one. This is the kind of iconic win condition of the format. If your library is empty, you win the game. This combos with both Demonic Consultation for just blue, blue, and black, naming a card that's not in your library to exile your entire library and win with a Thassa's Oracle trigger, and with Tainted Pact, which is very similar but is a little bit more useful as just a tutor itself. Exile down to the bottom card of your library, put that into your hand, and then you have an empty library and you win the game. This also pairs really well with the Underworld Breach combo, which we'll get to when we start to look at the red decks. This is the most efficient combo in this format for blue, blue, black. 3 mana, you can just win the game. Depending on the dynamics of the pod, people are not typically racing to do an early Thoracle Consult. It being kind of pip intensive makes it potentially hard to protect, and in general, people are looking to get behind some sort of protection for their win attempts so that they don't get blown out, because if you exile your entire library and then don't win the game, or even just using up your combo pieces and not winning the game, you're left in a pretty devastating spot. So this format, you'll see people really prioritize what people will call silence effects, which is something like a Grand Abolisher, where during your turn, your opponents can't cast spells or activate abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. Cutzel, which is a similar deal where your opponents can't cast spells on your turn. Ranger Captain of Eos, which both searches for a 1-drop and can be sacrificed to turn off non-creature spells from your opponents until end of turn. This one can be used reactively or proactively, cracking it on your opponent's turn when they're trying to win. And the namesake card of this sort of effect, Silence, which is just your opponents can't cast spells this turn for 1 white. So it's very often that the game is really about generating advantage, either through your commanders or other advantage pieces, sticking some sort of silence effect like a Grand Abolisher, and then winning the game with a Thassa's Oracle or some other combo depending on your list. Another combo that this deck gets access to is using Devoted Druid to make infinite mana to pump into our Thrasios, which we can do with Hazel's Brewmaster, one of the newest sort of combo pieces in the format. When Hazel's enters or attacks, you can exile a card from a graveyard to make a food token, and food you control have the activated abilities of creatures exile with Hazel's Brewmaster. So we can put a Devoted Druid into play or into our graveyard. Once Devoted Druid's in play, we can kill it with its untap ability by putting -1/-1 counters on it. Once it's in the graveyard, when we cast our Hazel's Brewmaster, when it enters, we're going to exile our Devoted Druid, and we'll have a food with these same abilities, meaning that this food can tap for green and untap itself by putting a -1/-1 counter on itself, but because it's a food and not a creature, it won't die. So we're going to net infinite green mana, bend that 9 infinite green mana into Thrasios, draw our whole deck, win however we want at that point. You can also do this same combo with Swift Reconfiguration, which is a 1 mana flash enchantment that turns a creature or vehicle into a vehicle. Using this on Devoted Druid gets us the same exact effect, where we get to net infinite green mana because it won't die with its untap ability. Another card and combo piece that's starting to become very popular in the format is Valley Floodcaller. 2 and a blue flash, you may cast non-creature spells as though they had flash, and then when you cast a non-creature spell, you untap birds, frogs, otters, and rats, and they get +1/+1. For a lot of decks, they only care about that second line of text there, that you give your non-creature spells flash. This means you can add instant speed, cast a demonic tutor, some other sort of very powerful effect like Culling Ritual, flash in mana rocks to generate mana while you're going. But this also opens up a combo with the card Retraction Helix, which is a blue instant until end of turn, target creature gains tap, return target online permanent to its owner's hand. So if we have a Valley Floodcaller that isn't summoning sick, what we can do is cast this on our Floodcaller, tap it to bounce a mana positive rock, let's say a Mox Amber. That'll return that to our hand. And then when we recast the Mox Amber, it's going to untap our Floodcaller because he untaps himself because he's an otter. And then we're going to be able to repeat this process over and over and get infinite mana, all at instant speed, that we can pump into our Thrasios to win the game. Opposition Agent is another really popular card in more mid-range black decks. Turning off your opponent's abilities to tutor is incredibly powerful. And if you can snag somebody else's tutor, like if you flash in an Opposition Agent and get their demonic tutor, that's probably setting you up to win. Getting any card out of your opponent's deck is very powerful, along with stopping other tutor effects. It becomes very hard to deal with in longer games, where a lot of the times these decks are just tutors and value engines. If they are drawing into tutors that are shut off, it's pretty bad. And then the last creature we're going to talk about here is Seedborn Muse, which untaps all permanents you control during each other player's untap step. This, along with Thrasios, is one of the more broken engines you can have, where I spend my turn to Seedborn Muse, pass in my next opponent's turn, I untap along with them, and then typically on their end step, I'm going to spend all my mana, pump it into Thrasios, and then untap with my next opponent. This basically gives you extra turns on your opponent's turns. Being able to draw lots of cards on their turns, very powerful. Combined with instant speed effects, it can be truly like taking 3 extra turns every turn cycle if you're able to just flash things in as you draw them. Very, very powerful. This is often a game-winning threat that must be stopped. Seedborn Muse with Thrasios, or really just in general, Seedborn Muse with anything to do with the mana, is very, very powerful. The sorceries in this deck, like I mentioned, there are lots of tutors in this format. Demonic Tutor being one of the prime ones. Diabolic Intent is another demonic tutor, but has you sacrifice a creature. Cards that aren't really as popular in other formats, but are really popular in cEDH are creature tutors that go into play. Finale of Devastation is kind of similar to like a Green Sun Zenith, but it can get you any creature out of your library or graveyard with mana cost X. This can also be used as a win condition because if X is 10 or more, all those creatures gain haste and +X+X. So players get infinite mana with their Thrasios, put all of their creatures into play, and then play a Finale of Devastation that's like 1,000,000, and swing out and kill all your opponents. Neoform and Eldritch Revolution are sort of birthing pod style effects, where Neoform has you sack a creature, search for one that costs 1 or more, put it into play with a +1/+1 counter. And Eldritch Revolution has you sack a creature and search for one that costs X or less, where X is 2 plus the creature's mana value. So for instance, if you sacrificed a Eternal Witness, you could get any creature out of your deck and put it into play. I could be in a spot where I turn a Mana Dork into an Opposition Agent to turn off suitors, where I turn it into a Cutzel or a Grand Abolisher to shut off my opponent's ability to win, or turn it into a Thassa's Oracle to put a game-winning threat on the stack. And those creatures just go straight into play. So they pass on those. Those creatures are in play. Their triggers are on the stack. You're dealing with it. 2 sort of very devastating cards in our format, because this is a multiplayer format, are Mnemonic Betrayal, which it's not uncommon for this to just win the game if it resolves in the mid-game. Any amount of mana into a Mnemonic Betrayal or Meme Bet probably closes the game out, because your opponents will have rituals, tutors, other very powerful effects that they've been trying to use to win, or their own combo pieces that you can win with. And then Culling Ritual, the board wipe of choice in the format. Destroy each non-land permanent mana value 2 or less, and then you get black or green mana for each permanent destroyed this way. It's not uncommon for it to make like 8 to 10 mana, especially if you do this again behind some kind of silence effect. You can kind of do whatever you want. You have that much mana. Putting it into Thrasios is reasonable. There's lots of different win lines you can go through at that point. Instance. cEDH is defined by interaction. It's often also defined by the color blue, but namely free or very efficient interaction is the name of the game. So expect to see cards like Force of Will, Mindbreak Trap, because your opponents are casting lots of spells typically, and you can often work with them to get this Mind Break Trap online. And often you can Mind Break Trap and hit multiple opponent spells at once it's enabled. Force of Negation, Fierce Guardianship, free counterspell if your commander's in play. Mental Misstep. This game is about efficiency, and like I mentioned, there are very powerful 1-mana spells like Demonic Consultation and Silence that you might want to stop, and Mental Misstep is another free bit of interaction. Pact of Negation, which is a free counterspell that you have to pay 5 for on your next upkeep. So if you use this on the turn you're trying to win, it's just 0-mana counterspell, and if you win the game, it doesn't matter. There are lots of decks that play lots and lots of spells a turn, and Flusterstorm is one of the hardest counterspells to beat because it will put a whole bunch of copies of itself on the stack, requires very niche answers. Other efficient stuff that we're going to see, more 1-mana tutors. Enlightened Tutor, you get artifacts and enchantments. Vampiric Tutor, anything you want on top of your deck. Worldly Tutor to go get one of those creatures that we want. The 1-mana top of library tutors are all very popular in this format. Mystical Tutor is pretty popular too, depending on the deck. Doesn't always show up though, because a lot of times you want those tutors to be good in the early game, and it can be a little awkward to tutor with Mystical Tutor on turn 1, where your best thing you can get is often a tutor or just a combo piece. You're not usually jamming combos that early, at least in this kind of deck. Other cheap interaction, we got Swords to Plowshares. We have Veil of Summer to turn off our opponent's counterspells. This is also very good against Orcish Bowmasters and bounce spells, which are very popular in the format. Term Can't Be Countered isn't on a lot of cards that are cEDH playable. Abrupt Decay just clears the bar. It hits enough things, and Can't Be Countered again this is a blue players format in a lot of ways, and there are lots of counterspells rolling around. I mentioned Valley Floodcaller already. That card, along with Born Upon a Wind, have absolutely changed our format. They were already pretty impactful the last time I did this list, although I don't think Floodcaller was out, but that density of that effect has totally changed the way people play, especially in decks like this that sit behind value engines like their commanders or some of these enchantments that we're going to get to, like Smothering Tithe, Rhystic Study. You're probably familiar with these cards. It is very common that players will sit there with a win attempt in their hand, passing the turn, letting themselves accrue more value, letting their opponents attempt to win, only for them to use an instant speed effect to be able to flash in a win attempt on their opponent's turns after everyone has spent up all their interaction. That is kind of the name of the game in a lot of the matches that you'll play of cEDH right now, is actually finding a window to win at instant speed. Green decks also have access to crop rotation to put any land into play, which can get them good lands like Gaia's Cradle or other utility pieces that we'll talk about. Maybe most powerfully in a lot of scenarios, it also gets Emergent Zone, which is a third flash enabling effect in this deck. So you have 3 spells that can just give you the ability to play at instant speed and potentially just win on top of your opponent's win attempts. Court of Calling is another creature tutor, putting stuff into play, lets you play at instant speed. And Cyclonic Rift, not just a casual card, especially in big games. Cyc Rift can be kind of necessary to clear out stacks pieces or other things shutting you down, stop your opponents from developing too hard. Artifacts. You will see lots of fast mana. You'll see the best fast mana. We have lost Mana Crypt, but we still have Chrome Mox, Lotus Petal, Mox Amber, Mox Diamond, Mana Vault, Soul Ring. Expect these to be in almost every deck. Mox Amber, not as much, depends on your commanders. The best of the Signet effects, like Arcane Signet, Felwar Stone. Grim Monolith is more popular now that Mana Crypt has been banned. Wishclaw Talisman is another to-hand tutor that's pretty popular in the format. You'll see a lot of politicking around this card because you have to pass it to one of your opponents. Knowing how to use Wishclaw and who to give it to is actually a skill that you kind of need to develop. You'll often see people making deals over getting the Wishclaw. We do have that Basalt Monolith to combo with Kinnan to make infinite mana. And then the One Ring is pretty popular in cEDH. It's not in every single deck. In decks that especially that want to go into a long game, the longer the game goes, the better the One Ring starts to be in comparison to a lot of these other value engines that don't always give you a lot of cards. If your opponents are playing very patiently, Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora don't really work out that well for you. But the One Ring, the more patiently your opponents are playing, the better it gets. The longer this game goes, the better. And very notably, Seedborn Muse untaps that bad boy. So Seedborn Muse plus the One Ring gets really ridiculous really fast. Enchantments. Carpet of Flowers. It's a very blue-centric format, and this can net you some mana off of that, starting to become more popular. Notably, the absence of Dockside Exorcist means playing out these enchantments that will just sit and play for a while potentially is much less punished now. There's not a lot that punishes it other than like the Culling Ritual we looked at. Mystic Remora, often just called the Fish. When an opponent casts a spell, they got to pay 4 mana or you draw a card for non-creature spells, that is. And it has cumulative upkeep 1, so every turn, first turn you use it, come back to you, you got to pay 1 to keep it. After that, you got to pay 2, 3, 4 as the game goes. Knowing whether to pay for your fish or let it go is kind of a big skill when you deploy your fish if you have enough mana to support it. It is one of the more warping engines because paying 4 extra for your spells is often impossible, but it does have a timer on it. A lot of times you'll see opponents, when a Mystic Remora goes onto the stack, make a deal with each other not to feed the fish, and meaning we're not going to cast non-creature spells until this thing goes away, especially if it looks like the player is kind of starved for mana and is likely going to have to let that fish go to develop. Swift reconfiguration we talked about. That's mainly here to combo with our Devoted Druid. Survival of the Fittest is a sort of engine that lets you continually tutor for creatures. The most powerful synergy in this deck that it has is that we can discard any one of our creatures and get a Devoted Druid, and then discard that and get a Hazel's Brewmaster and Devoted Druids in our graveyard. So when we cast the Brewmaster, we get infinite green mana. This is kind of a 1-card combo at this point, where like 1.5, it combos with basically any creature in our deck and having green mana around. And then again, you can also use this when your opponent goes to cast a tutor, pitch that mana dork that's useless, go get an opposition agent, cast that, snag their tutor. Rhystic Study, one of the most powerful cards in our format. A lot of times, this is like the tutor target of choice in the early game. When somebody goes like land, mox, pass, cast a tutor, they're probably getting Rhystic Study or they're getting a way to win. Some sort of advantage. Often Rhystic Study, if you could do this by turn 2, it is warping the game. The game will become about Rhystic Studies a lot of the time. Smothering Tithe is a card that is becoming more and more popular in cEDH. Opponents are drawing cards, there's lots of draw engines, you're making treasures. And again, the more you play at instant speed, the better this card gets too, because I'm netting mana on your turns. Maybe I didn't have a way or enough mana to win on my turn, but you guys have made me so many treasures. I can Born Upon a Win, Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation now. And then mana bases in cEDH. Very often you will see Ancient Tomb, you're going to see dual lands and fetch lands, the full suite of them that your deck can play. You really want to prioritize having the best mana possible. Rainbow lands like Command Tower, City of Brass, Mana Confluence are also very popular. You might see decks dig a little deeper than that as well. Some of the utility lands that you'll see are things like Boseiju and Otawara, which are known as channel lands. These are some of the most powerful effects in the game. They're one of the few things that can just get around counter spells. These have to be redirected or stifled in some way. These are one of the few ways you can get around a silence effect, for instance, where if my opponent silences us and then casts the Hazel's Brewmaster, I can, with that Brewmaster trigger on the stack, Otawara and bounce that Brewmaster. Even though I can't cast spells, I'm still allowed to activate abilities of cards in my hand. So Otawara and Boseiju namely being the ones in that cycle that you should expect to see in every single green or blue deck. And then it's pretty common you will also see in very creature heavy decks that they run Gaia's Cradle. As green has become more popular since red got nerfed with losing Dockside Extortionist, Gaia's Cradle is starting to become more and more of a staple in our format, and it works really well with the crop rotation package. And then Surveillance are decently popular in our format as well, usually seeing like one in a deck, depending on the colors of the deck and things like that. Not too uncommon that it's just kind of free value for them to run. Tymna Thrasios tends to play a very mid-rangey game, like we said, where they're going to develop some amount of mana engines or value in the early game, whether it's dorks or ways to draw cards or make more mana in some kind of way. Look to get into a position where they have sort of an overwhelming lead, where they can finally start to push a win. Their opponents have used up their resources. You've stopped them from winning. You're going into your turn with a Ranger Captain, or you can tutor for a Cutzel and try to win very safely with a lot of resources available. One of the only other creatures we didn't see, which are starting to become less popular, are clone effects. Mockingbird is a clone that is X in a blue, and it can enter as a copy of a creature that has mana value less than or equal to the mana spent to cast Mockingbird. X has 1 on it. I have spent 2 mana. I can get an Orcish Bowmasters. Clones are still a pretty big part of our format. Cards like Phyrexian Metamorph are still fairly popular. Without Dockside Extortionist, though, they have become much less popular, where you were seeing decks run up to 4 clone effects. Now it's a little bit less necessary. Tymna Thrasios is sort of the mid-range value engine grindy deck of the format right now. If that's the kind of game plan you're looking for, this is kind of the direction I'd push you in. And this is the deck I think currently that is sort of dictating a lot of play. You need to be able to beat their early interaction. If you are trying to play a long game, you need to know that these are the decks that are going to kind of bury you in the long game. So you either want to shut the door on them before they get developed, or help stifle their development, or again, just play a faster deck that just gets underneath them and tries to win before they're even really set up. Use the link in the description below to download Whatnot, and you'll get $15 to use to buy Magic singles, sealed product, get anything that you want really. There's no limits. You just get $15 on the account for free just for signing up. Use the link in the description below. Give Whatnot a try. Okay, next we're going to be taking a look at Rogsai. We got this list from M. Schmidt. I had to duplicate the list because a lot of the cards were Japanese, and I knew that would just be a nuisance, me trying to explain Japanese cards to you, so that's why I copied it. Rograk and Silas, also known as Rogsai, is the definitive turbo deck of the format. It is the deck that other fast decks are judged by and sort of compared to. You are in Grixis colors, which are typically considered the best for going fast. You get access to the Thassa's Oracle combos we talked about, as well as Underworld Breach, which we'll go over. Compared to a lot of red decks, this deck seemed to lose less than most of them. Dockside Extortionist wasn't really a key card of this deck because especially making early win attempts, Dockside is usually not at its best. When the Dockside count was only 1 or 2, he doesn't really do a lot other than mana fix, which does come up. And this deck uses Rograk as a source of mana generation and just enabling a lot of mana production in a lot of different ways that we'll talk about. That makes it get hurt a little bit less by losing things like Mana Crypt. Why these commanders? Silas Wren doesn't really do much of anything. He's kind of just here for colors. We are basically a Rograk deck as our commander, using Silas Wren to give us access to blue and black cards, which are arguably the best in the format. Rograk is a 0 mana commander. He doesn't really do anything. He's just a 0/1. What he does do is give you a body in play every game, turn 1, basically always, and he gives you a commander in play, who's a legendary creature. This enables a few different cards that we didn't see or won't see as often in other decks, even in the same colors. So for instance, Infernal Plunge, 1 red, sack a creature, add 3 red. So we always have a creature lying around a sacrifice. So Rograk, turn 1, makes Infernal Plunge always online. The same is with Diabolic Intent, which we talked about in TNT. Basically, we have 2 Demonic Tutors in our deck. Culling the Weak, similar card, black, as additional cost to cast it, sack a creature, get 4 black. One of the other more powerful things this enables is cards like Deflecting Swat, which is one of the free commander spells. You have a commander in play, cast it for free, and you can change the target of a spell or ability. So like if someone casts a counterspell on you, you can cast Deflecting Swat for free because you have Rograk in play, and you can redirect their counterspell to Deflecting Swat, basically countering it. This also works with Fierce Guardianship with its nonsensical art, free counterspell. Deadly Rollick is a removal spell, and maybe most powerfully, Flare of Duplication, which came from MH3, which is 3 mana, but we can also sacrifice a non-token red creature rather than pay its mana cost. So for free, by sacrificing Rograk, we can copy target instant or sorcery spell. This is really, really broken. This is one of the best cards in this deck. We can do really powerful things like double our tutors. If we use this on a demonic tutor, we get 2 demonic tutors. That assembles a whole combo by itself. We can even use this on a card like Tainted Pact and have a Tainted Pact on the stack, sacrifice our Rograk, exile our deck until we get to Thras' Oracle, put that into our hand, and then let the original resolve, exile the rest of our deck, double Tainted Pact to just win the game immediately because the Oracle is in our hand. We've exiled our entire library. We're ready to go. Flare is very, very powerful, and you can use it on your opponent's spells. So you can play Rograk early, not even be representing any mana. If someone casts a very powerful format defining card like Ad Nauseam, then we can copy their Ad Nauseam. We'll talk more about Ad Nauseam when we get down to it. We are basically a storm deck. A lot of times, if we're not doing very fast, easy Thras' Oracle or Underworld Breach wins, we're having to kind of chain things together as we go, trying to net mana and find the line because our margins are very tight. We're trying to win very early, typically not on the most resources. We're not getting a super huge development. Often we're trying to win early, taking advantage of that Rograk. As the game goes longer, you start sacrificing him, using him up, he gets killed by a Bowmasters. We lose the advantage of Rograk as sort of a mana enabler. We don't have anything else going for us in the command zone, so we sort of lose power as the game goes on. Ragavan is a staple of red decks. When it deals combat damage to a player, you get a treasure and you exile their top card and you can cast it. A little too good not to play. It's a little bit worse now that there are a lot of green decks flying around, lots of Thrasios ready to block him, but still, Ragavan just offers a ton. Bowmasters isn't in every Rockside deck. It doesn't really line up with them trying to jam fast win attempts, but Rocksides are known for their density of wheel effects like Wheel of Fortune, Time Twister, Windfall, where the entire table draws like up to 21 cards. Orcish Bowmasters just becomes a win condition very quickly, especially if you can wheel multiple times. Thras' Oracle, we talked about. Burgi really only comes up in red proactive decks. Cast a spell, add a red, and you don't lose that mana until end of turn. But also this deck and a lot of these other decks tend to use Harnfell as well, which is a 5 mana artifact that you can discard a card and exile the top 2 cards of your library, and you can play those this turn. If we have Burgi in play, we can, cast a Burgi, start to cast other spells and net mana as we go, making a lot of our spells mana positive. So we can use it if we cast like an Ad Nauseam, get access to a whole bunch of our cards, or a wheel, get a bunch of cards, cast spells, net mana. But the other side of it is if we have a bunch of cards and we don't really need, mana to get us there, we've already done the thing. We've either cast a wheel or an Ad Nauseam to get a bunch of cards into our hand. We can start just discarding cards and getting the rest of our deck. It pairs super well with Wheel because if we have a Harnfell and we resolve a Wheel of Fortune, we have 7 new cards. Our opponents also get 7 new cards, but really we get 14 cards because we can pitch what we don't want to Harnfell and get 2 cards for each one that we discard. So Harnfell pairs really well with a lot of overlapping things that again, we'll talk about with the Nas and especially with Underworld Breach. Valley Floodcaller isn't a combo piece in this deck, but has a really powerful synergy with other stuff. One, it just enables instant speed stuff that we can do, but it also pairs really well with things like Necropotence, which is another staple of this format. Necropotence, you skip your draw step. When you discard a card, you exile it. Not all downside though, because you can pay 1 life, exile your top card, put it into your hand at the beginning of your next end step. So if we have a Valley Floodcaller in play and we Necropotence and we get like 30 cards into our hand on our end step, before we move to cleanup, we can cast those non-creature spells as though they had flash. This also works with Born Upon a Wind. If we have a way to give ourselves the ability to play at instant speed, we can use that entire Necropotence pile of cards in our end step and often win the game in our end step with very little life. Sorceries. Gamble is another pretty powerful card you get access to in red. 1 red mana, search library for a card, discard a card at random. Sometimes you discard the card you search for. Your odds are never worse than 50-50 though, unless you only have 1 in hand, in which case, what did you expect? This is the best rate to tutor in the game. If the gamble works for you, then it is the most powerful tutor in our format, probably. If it doesn't work for you, yeah, it can feel bad, but odds are it works. And we also get to use our graveyard in this format a lot. Taxing Probe you can use to check your opponents. We can also use it to crack top deck tutors like Imperial Seal, which is a vamp tutor at sorcery speed. And again, those other tutor effects like we talked about, Mystical Tutor and Vampiric Tutor. This deck is a bunch of tutors to find ways to win the game. Praetor's Grasp lets you tutor your opponent's libraries. Beseech the Mirror is a 4 mana tutor that you can sack a artifact, enchantment, or token while you cast it. And if you do, if you search for something that costs 4 or less, you can play it for free. So this can be one of the best rates for a tutor. For instance, if you cast Beseech the Mirror, you spent 4 mana and you tutor for a 4 mana spell, like let's say you tutor for the One Ring. That would have been a 6 mana play if you use Demonic Tutor to go get it, but you got to spend 4 mana. Also, that works with Flare of Duplication, so you can double the Beseech the Mirror and it will cast both those spells for free. It's very broken. Another really powerful enabler this deck gets, because you always have your commander in play, is Jeska's Will, which is 2 in a red sorcery. You can choose one, but you get both modes if you have a commander in play. And you add red for each card in target opponent's hand, and you exile the top 3 cards of your library. You play them this turn. So if you get to play this turn 1, it is very often make 7 red mana and get the top 3 cards of your deck. That's very busted. Jeska's Will often leads to some of the most powerful plays you get to do in this deck, especially if you have a payoff for it in hand. Like if you have a Jeska's Will in hand already and you have a Wheel of Fortune, you're going to net, 4-ish mana off the Jeska's Will, get 3 cards, get to use those cards, get to use some of your hand maybe a little bit, and wheel, get 7 new cards. It's really what this deck is trying to do. It's kind of trying to push and find things. You're wheeling and dealing. You are dumping your hand because you run lots of ritual effects. You're going to dump your hand with things like Culling the Weak, Dark Ritual, lots of our 0 mana and cheap artifacts that net us mana. Cast a bunch of those and then wheel very early in the game to, maybe you have 1 or 2 cards left in hand and you're floating a bunch of mana. You get 7 brand new cards. You get to go again. You're wheeling a lot. So cards like Mnemonic Betrayal start to become very real very quickly, where you're getting a bunch of cards in your opponent's graveyard. Yawgmoth's will allow you to cast spells from your graveyard, though it does shut off things going to your yard. So some combo lines it stops because things get exiled if they go to your graveyard. You're often either casting a bunch of spells, trying to find more and more things to do, and just outvaluing your opponents in terms of equity by taking more game actions and spending more mana than them. Or you're just make a bunch of mana, resolve a tutor or 2, find a combo piece, win, because you have so many combo pieces and so many ways to find them. Because we get to do a lot of this, because we can get a whole bunch of cards, and if we're not winning, we're like a mana off of winning. Warrior's Oath, Last Chance, and Final Fortune, which all have the same text. They're all red. Take an extra turn after this one. At the beginning of that turn's end step, you lose the game. So a lot of times we'll jam a bunch, do some tutoring. Maybe we do some wheels, take an extra turn, untap with all our mana again, jam a win attempt. We're going to lose at the end of the turn. Doesn't matter. We're going to win when that happens. It's fine. So yeah, we run lots of cheap interaction. We're not really trying to stop our opponents from winning. We will if we have to, but namely we're trying to protect our own win attempts. You'll see this deck isn't running Force of Negation, which we saw in like Tymna Thrasios, and they're running other cheap interaction that is really at its best in the early game, like Daze. There's that Born Upon a Wind we talked about, Brain Freeze, which is a combo piece with our Breach. We're going to get there. But first I want to talk about Ad Nauseam. This is a card that has been archetypally defining in the format. I think right now, since things have gotten slower without Mana Crypt, Jewel Lotus, and Dockside, mainly Crypt and Dockside, it is a little bit harder to both power out early Ad Nauseams and to convert them into wins because there's less mana to get. Ad Nauseam is 5 mana instant, 3 black, reveal the top card of your library, put it into your hand, you lose life equal to its mana cost, and you may repeat this process any number of times. Very often, the play pattern of Ad Nauseam is cast a ritual or 2, Ad Nauseam at a high life total, ideally, and then start revealing cards off the top of your library. So you can see on Moxfield, they have a really cool feature that says you're playing Ad Nauseam and tells you your mana value without Ad Nauseam. So the average is 1.35. So I basically, with an Ad Nauseam, on average, I'm hitting 1.35 life a card. So at 40 life, I get quite a few cards before I have to start thinking about my life total. And you have other things that will use your life total and people will try to pressure you because you're an ad nauseum and a necropotence deck. Both these cards use your life totals. But very often in this deck, we have so many ways to generate mana because of Rograk that we can tap out for it at maybe not even that much life, maybe 30 life and still expect to win because we have things like Mox Amber. The Paradise Mantle is a way to get mana kind of before the Nas usually. Rituals like Rite of Flame that decks are starting to run less of. The Infernal Plunge, the Culling the Weak. We have so many ways to net mana in our deck that often we can ad nauseum generate a little bit of mana and that'll get us to a win. We don't often need that much. And again, it also overlaps with those Final Fortune effects because if we can Nas, sculpt a hand that wins the game, all we need is double red to get that extra turn to win. Artifacts. We've got even more of the fast mana available to us. Springleaf Drum works very well with Rograk as well as Paradise Mantle, which also works really well with Valley Floodcaller because he untaps himself, remember. Defense Grid you'll see in Turbo decks. This is sort of our way to do a silence effect, make people spend 3 more mana on our turn. It is kind of a scary card because it works for everybody, so you shut off other people's interaction, but this is not a deck that's trying to sit around and interact. We're trying to win the game. I will say the One Ring is not a very popular deck card in Rogsai. It may start to become one as the format slowed down, but especially pre-ban, it was not very common you'd see this because we're not trying to play a long game where the One Ring is very good. And then the rest is just sort of Signet effects. Chromatic Star. This is actually mainly a Bolas's Citadel card, which you will see in some Rogsai decks. This player has opted to use it anyways. Might just be good enough anyways. It's besiege fodder. It's just cycles. It's fine. Mana fixes. So let's talk about Underworld Breach. This is the draw to red at the moment. There's basically 2 reasons to play red in our format now, and it's Underworld Breach and Rograk. Rograk being a 0 mana commander, if you're not used to this format, it may be hard to wrap your head around, is arguably the most powerful commander in our format. Just what he enables is busted. Even if his Rograk decks aren't the best thing at any given moment in a metagame, he is likely the most powerful commander in any given scenario. Underworld Breach is the other reason to play red. It's kind of the main one that applies to most decks. For 1 in a red, we get an enchantment that has each non-land card in your graveyard has escape. The escape cost is equal to the card's mana value plus exile 3 other cards from your graveyard. Beginning of your end step, sacrifice Underworld Breach. Basically what this card says is you can cast spells from your graveyard by exiling 3 other cards in your graveyard. If I have an Underworld Breach and I have a Lion's Eye Diamond, I can cast Lion's Eye Diamond for 0 mana, exile 3 other cards from my deck, maybe it's 3 lands, whatever, from my graveyard, and I can, as long as I can keep doing that, I can keep cracking Lion's Eye Diamond, discarding my hand, and netting mana, and basically turning it into a Black Lotus. What we can do as the main combo line with Underworld Breach is use Lion's Eye Diamond to make lots and lots of blue mana, and Brain Freeze to mill ourselves with Storm, so that we will be able to net more cards in our graveyard than we'll ever have to exile, because Brain Freeze will net us 6 cards for each time we do this iteration, where we have a breach, cast an LED, that's storm count of 2, cast the Brain Freeze, storm count of 3, we're going to mill 9 cards, and then we already have enough to do the thing again. We cast the LED, exile 3, cast the Brain Freeze again, exile 3 more, and now we're netting more and more cards into our graveyard as we go, until we have a whole bunch of mana, and basically our entire deck in the graveyard. From there, we can cast the Thras' Oracle because our library is empty and win the game. We could also, if we don't have access to our Thras' Oracle, use Brain Freeze and start milling out our opponents and force them to draw to make them lose the game. It may sound a little wonky as a 3-card combo that requires you to run Lion's Eye Diamond, which isn't the best in a lot of scenarios. You don't usually want to discard your hand. And Brain Freeze, which is just mill target player, like that obviously doesn't seem like the best cards in Magic. The real power in Underworld Breach is that it's very compact and it assembles itself incredibly well. You know, like I've been saying, we end up with cards in our graveyard. We're kind of churning through our deck. We're casting Wheels. We're casting cards that have a sacrifice our commander who we can put into the graveyard to help with Breach. We're getting tutors in our yard. We're getting rituals in there. At any point, we can just draw Underworld Breach, escape a demonic tutor or a gamble or any other to hand tutor. The Breach combo just assembles itself. It's not that uncommon that Underworld Breach is used to assemble other combos or is used for value to get you back into the game. Again, it can just be a self-assembling combo. It's the most self-contained combo in the format because it basically assembles itself. As you play the game, Underworld Breach just gets more and more powerful. So it is arguably the best combo in our format. It is less popular now just because red is less popular because Dockside Extortionist is gone, and now Breach is kind of the only broken red card other than Flare, which is only good in Rograk decks, really, and Deflecting Swat, which is really powerful, actually. We can Breach and Praetor's Grasp our opponents and get their combos. If say we've lost our Thras' Oracle, we can get theirs to win the game. This deck is kind of defined by how many different ways there are to win, even though there's really only Thras' Oracle as a win con. Because you have Meme Bet, because you have Praetor's Grasp, because you have Orcish Bowmasters and Wheels, there are so many different ways you can win and piece things together, even when you lose a lot of cards. You can lose a lot of your deck, and then you realize like, oh, I still have Yogg-Will to get back my Meme Bet that got countered, and I can brain freeze my opponents while I'm at it to get more cards in their yard for me to win with Mnemonic Betrayal. This can be a just jam, win fast, don't even think kind of deck, but it's usually not. It's usually requiring you to go through lots of fairly complex combo lines where your margins are very tight, where you're going to be make or break on 1 mana. You're going to have to use cards that you didn't know you could use that way. You're really going to push yourself. I think it's a ton of fun. It's a very proactive leaning deck. You can see we're only on 24 lands. It's not that uncommon to go to 23, and it is a very all-in, greatness at any cost kind of deck. And if that is your play style, it is one of the most fun decks you can play in our format, I think. It has quite a steep learning curve. It's very powerful. It is arguably worse post bans because of how popular other kind of control style decks are. But in terms of actual power level, it really hasn't gotten any weaker. It might just be positioned a little worse at the moment. By the time you're watching this, it might be the best deck in the format again, which I think it was before the bans happened. Okay, so next we're going to look at what was the defining deck of the format, Tymna Kraum, and has now started to fall off, but it's still very popular. So I want to talk about it, and it still has a lot of things going for it. You can kind of think of this deck as sliding right in between Tymna Thrasios and Rogsai, the 2 decks we just looked at. You're in similar colors to both. This deck has red instead of green, unlike TNT, and it's adding white that Rogsai doesn't get access to. You have Tymna the Weaver as a potential advantage engine, as well as Kraum, which when Jeweled Lotus was legal was arguably one of the best commanders for sure, because he draws cards off of your opponent's taking game actions, which is powerful. Opponent casts their second spell each turn, you draw a card. It's just without Jeweled Lotus and Mana Crypt, it's a lot harder to get him into play. So Tymna Kraum, you're going to see a lot of the cards we've already looked at. So some of these sections will get faster as we go. Esper Sentinel, the Mockingbird, Ragavan, Staples, Grand Abolisher. You see a lot of the cards we saw either in TNT or in Rogsai. You also, in this deck at least, have Phantasmal Image, which is a 2-mana clone that when it's targeted, sacrifices itself. And Phyrexian Metamorph, which is 3 mana, or you can pay a blue or 2 life, and it can enter as a copy of any creature or artifact on the battlefield. So you can copy somebody's One Ring, for instance. The only other thing we haven't looked at here is Drannith Magistrate, which is 2 mana. Opponents can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hands, which means we shut off things like Underworld Breach, Mnemonic Betrayal, and Commanders. Can't cast from exile, can't cast from the command zone, can't cast from the graveyard, from the library, none of that. Better be in your hand or you can't do it, bud. That had became a little bit less popular. I think as the game slows down, will start to be more popular. It hurts some decks more than others. Be mindful of that when you're deploying it, like any sort of stacks effect. Tymna Kraum is often known for playing sort of the best cards in their colors, developing advantage with Tymnas and Kraums, and then Rhystic Mystic, Smothering Ties, cards we've looked at, getting into a really good position like the TNT, and setting up sort of an unbeatable state where they start their turn with a silence. If that doesn't work, they cast a Grand Abolisher, and they're going to try to set up some sort of Underworld Breach line or win with Thras' Oracle. And there are a few things you get access to with Underworld Breach and White that we'll go over. Sorceries, it shares a lot with both of those decks we already looked at. They're not going to go as deep on some of the tutors that Rogsai does and some of the rituals. They rely a bit more on engines and seeing more cards in a game and not necessarily trying to find a way to win and close out the game as quickly as possible. The one card we haven't looked at is Sevinne's Reclamation, which is 2 and a white, return target permanent card, mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. But if this was cast from a graveyard, you may copy the spell and may choose a new target for the copy. And it has flashback, 4 and a white. This card is just generically pretty good. You can use it to get back your Ranger Captain, your Bowmasters, whatever. But most notably is used in red and blue decks because of its synergy with Underworld Breach. Because if our Underworld Breach ends up in the graveyard, we can use this to get it back to refire a Breach when attempt or start for the first time because we might have put it in our graveyard. These colors, really the Jeskai colors, are known for their Breach lines as being their main ways to win because of the combination of Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond, Brain Freeze, which we talked about, which are red and blue, Sevinne's Reclamation and white, which gives us access to a way to get our Breach out of the yard, and Intuition, which has you search for 3 cards and reveal them to a target opponent. They choose a card, you put that one in your hand and the other 2 in your graveyard. So what you'll often do is do what's called an intuition pile, where you will cast Intuition, target one of your opponents, and you will search for Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond, and Savine's Reclamation often. This can depend on what cards you already have access to, but this pile on its own, no matter what they give you, you'll be able to cast an Underworld Breach either by using LED and flashbacking Savine's Rec, casting Savine's Rec from your hand, or casting Breach from your hand, depending on what they give you. And then you can recast that Intuition to get Brain Freeze by escaping it with Underworld Breach, and then you have assembled the combo. This is potentially mana intensive, done on all in the same turn, but is basically a 1-card combo with Intuition just assembling the whole thing. Depending on how many cards you have in your graveyard, it gets even easier to do, or it can be impossible to do very early in the game. If you have no cards in yard, you'll have to get more in your yard. But the good thing about Intuition is you can often use it in a political situation where your opponents are forced to let it resolve. Let's say your opponent has an Ad Nauseam on the stack you want to counter, cast Intuition targeting one of your opponents who isn't casting the Ad Nauseam, and then you get a counter spell as well as, say, Savine's Rec and Underworld Breach. Instance, a lot of the stuff we've seen before. Free and cheap interaction. Tymna Kraum is a bit more reactive than Sisay. They tend to play a try not to lose game where they get advantage from opponents taking game actions. They want people casting spells and fighting over counter wars and drawing them cards. An Offer You Can't Refuse is a counter spell we haven't looked at yet, which counters target non-creature spell. Its controller creates 2 treasures. You can use this on your own spell to make treasures or use it on opponent if you have to. Chain of Vapor is one we haven't talked about. It is a bounce spell, but then whoever's permanent you bounce, they can sacrifice a land to repeat the process and keep doing this. Repeat the chain is what you'll hear. This can be used politically. Let's say there's a game-winning creature in play. I can use it on that person's creature and bounce it, or I could use it on one of my opponent's things and try to force them to copy the chain, and that way I can get a little bit of advantage out of it. Notably, when you're trying to win, it is kind of a ritual, because what you'll do is cast Chain of Vapor, let's say on your Mox Amber, bounce it to hand, repeat the chain, cast it on my Soul Ring, repeat the chain, put it on my Mana Vault, repeat the chain, and then I can net a whole bunch of mana as well as get lands in my graveyard, which helps in my Underworld Breach. The rest of this are kind of cards we've already seen. Rituals like Cabal Ritual. This deck does run Final Fortune. You tend to see red decks opt for at least Final Fortune. They don't usually go as deep as Sisay. Psych Rift for the mid game. Fire Covenant is a pretty good board wipe. You'll often either see this or Toxic Deluge come up. Pay X life. When you cast it, it's an instant. You deal X damage divided as you choose. And then we are an Ad Nauseam deck, but notably this is not a turbo Ad Nauseam deck. This is a deck that in the mid game will try to resolve an Ad Nauseam, usually add instant speed, get a bunch of cards and try to untap and win with them. Artifacts, lots of the same stuff. Talismans, the best fast mana, Witchclaw Talisman, and the One Ring, which is starting to become more popular as the game gets a little slower. And then enchantments. Starting to see the same things. The Smothering Tithe, Rhystic, Breach, Mystic. You can see how we sort of toe the line between Sisay, where we are a Breach combo deck. We're not trying to jam it. We're trying to do it behind a Grand Abolisher so that we don't get blown out. We want to draw cards. We want the game to go a little bit longer, and we want to be able to very safely win the game. But we do have that ability, which you should keep in mind, that any control sort of deck at any point could just decide, you know what, I'm going to go turn 1 creature, turn 2 Dark Rit, Culling Ritual, Ad Nauseam, and try to win. Or I'm going to go turn 1 land, Mox Diamond, whatever, pass, turn 2 land, Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation. These decks can always pivot to a fast plan. They can try to make their opponents have the interaction, but they don't always try to do that. They're not trying to force it. That's sort of part of the flexibility of these piles. They get to run just the best cards and the best combos. In the mana base, you're not going to see anything too wild out of Tymna Kraum. Gemstone Caverns is a staple of the format, where if you're not going first, which you often won't, you can exile a card from your hand and begin the game with this in play, and it taps for 1 mana of any color. If you do that, that can be a pretty powerful start, especially if you keep 7 going like second or third. And you will see some Tymna Kraums opt to run Cavern of Souls, usually naming human to make their humans uncounterable, which is very, very hard to deal with on like a Grand Abolisher. Uncounterable Grand Abolisher is basically game over. Now we're going to be taking a look at a deck that is, I think, kind of surprisingly in a similar position to Tymna Kraum, where it currently isn't really overperforming. You tend to see a lot of newer pilots opt to run Kinnan, which can make its overall stats not look that impressive, where in very competent hands, Kinnan can do the thing. This list, for instance, got second at the Boil 2, which is a 320 plus player event, but it is incredibly popular. Even if whatever, there's some way for me objectively to look and say like Kinnan's actually not good, it doesn't really matter what's good. What matters is what's popular. You're going to play against Kinnan if you play cEDH. That's the name of the game. And if you'd like to play cEDH, you can play Kinnan and you can do well with it because it has the power to be a very strong deck. Kinnan Bonner Prodigy. We saw this with Basalt Monolith and Tymna Thras. It is a very popular combo enabler in Thrasios decks. And in this deck, it also enables Thrasios as an enabler for Kinnan, kind of, or an outlet at least. When you build your deck around Kinnan, you get to do some pretty interesting things as well. We get green and blue. So we're missing white, black, red, most of them, right? So we miss a lot of those really powerful tutors, silence effects, whatever red offers now, breach, I guess. And we always get access to Kinnan's pretty powerful effect. Whenever you tap a non-land permanent for mana, add 1 mana of any type that permanent produced. We're going to build a lot of our deck around that. We already mentioned the combo with Basalt Monolith. Kinnan makes a tap for 4. You can spend 3 to untap it, tap for 4, untap it, netting a colorless every time, net infinite colorless mana. But we're going to run a whole lot of things that tap for mana because Kinnan makes them twice as good, usually. He doesn't actually double. So like Bloom Tender still only makes 1 more mana. Birds, these elves, Armored Scrap Gorger, everything with Enduring Vitality in play, new card. All of these will get to tap for more mana, so we get very explosive starts very quickly. Like if you get to go land, dork, pass, turn 2, land, Kinnan, dork, tap for 2 green, cast a rock, tap it for 2, cast something else. It gets very explosive very quickly. So there's kind of 2 halves of what Kinnan does though. We want to make a bunch of mana and we run lots of mana sources to do that, and we take advantage of Kinnan's first ability. As a commander though, we take advantage of his second ability, which is 7 mana, 5 green, blue. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a non-human creature card from among them onto the battlefield, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So we can spend 7 mana and put a creature into play. So we could spend mana and put a Consecrated Sphinx into play. We could put a Hullbreaker Horror into play. Nezahal, Wandering Archaic, any of these non-humans. You might be thinking, well, a lot of these just cost 7 mana anyways. We're not even really getting that good of a deal. We're not really, but what we are getting is a whole lot of mana to put into this. So, like I mentioned, we can net a whole lot of mana. So if we have 7 mana on Kinnan, which is doable on turn 2, fairly common is active on turn 3, hold up that 7 mana, interact with our opponents, because it's hard for us to jam wins because we don't have that many ways to find what we're doing and our pieces require multiple things. But we can hold up our ability to activate Kinnan and play it like sort of like a Thrasios, but that has way more explosive potential. So we can hold up interaction, use that if we need to, or we could just like on your instep activate Kinnan. You know, maybe I only hit like a Enduring Vitality or an Endurance, you know, one of these 2 drops, but I could also just hit Hullbreaker Horror and win the game. Because Hullbreaker Horror and Tidespout Tyrant are both known for just winning the game. Basically, both of them in this deck, their main use is that them, along with mana positive mana rocks, you can cast one of these, bounce another to your hand. Like if I cast a Mox Amber, I can bounce Soul Ring to my hand, tap the Mox Amber for mana, cast a Soul Ring, bounce the Amber, and we go back and forth. Kind of similar to what we do with the Valley Floodcaller combo, only using 2 different rocks to bounce them between each other. And if there's any piece sort of stopping us in between this, as long as we have another spell, we can use the first cast to bounce like a Ristic Study or any other stacks piece or whatever, and then do our combo. Let's kind of take a look at our creature slots. So we have Fairy Mastermind, which can be an engine. We can also use it with infinite mana to make our opponents draw, and we can do some weird endurance loops to make sure we don't die. Spellskite will allow us to protect our creatures, which is a big part of playing Kinnan. We run very big, very powerful creatures. We want them to stay in the battlefield. Similar to the Thrasios decks, we can use Kinnan with Basalt Monolith to net infinite mana and pump that mana into Thrasios, draw our whole deck, and do whatever we want from there. Endurance we can use to stop our opponents from being able to win. We mentioned Underworld Breach. This also stops Thassa's Oracle, because if they have cards in their yard, the Oracle checks their devotion to blue. If they have a bunch of cards in their deck that you shuffled in now that were in their yard, they no longer get to win the game. Enduring Vitality turns all our creatures into mana dorks. We already mentioned that's really good with Kinnan. Valley Floodcaller, playing at instant speed. It's a big deal. Clever Impersonator is a clone that can hit any non-land permanent. Lintel Inger is a pretty cool one. Usually only Kinnan's play, where you can spin a blue, sacrifice it, counter target non-creature spell, and it comes back 1 time with persist. So it comes back with a -1/-1 counter. Other cards we talked about, like Phyrexian Metamorph as a clone. Seedborn Muse, similar to how it works with Thrasios, is very overwhelming. And Kinnan, this basically wins the game though. If they have the mana to activate Kinnan every turn, they will start to hit big flips and just absolutely take over the game. And some of the big flip things we're going to hit are things like Wandering Archaic, which when an opponent casts an instant or sorcery, they have to pay 2, otherwise you can copy that spell. Con Sphinx, when an opponent draws a card, you draw 2 cards. This tends to just win the game if it hits the battlefield. If it makes it a turn cycle, game's basically over. Colossal Sky Turtle, we're not really trying to flip into. We just use it for those channel abilities, which are very hard to interact with. We mentioned the Hullbreaker and the Tidespout as combo enablers. Nezahal is also a card that's going to draw us a whole bunch of cards. Very hard to deal with. Once you have a lot of cards in your hand, you can protect it by discarding. Just a powerful card. And then Nyx Illumination also just wins the game. We triple our mana production. So when you would have been able to activate Kinnan once, now you can activate him 3 times. A lot of things just tap for a zillion mana and you'll just win the game. You'll just stumble into a win once Nyx Illumination gets into play. We have things like Trophy Mage, which find our Basalt Monolith, or Mirage Mirror, which is a combo piece that we'll go over. And we're going to have some density of tutors like all cEDH decks do. Invasion Ikoria can go get non-humans, put them into play. Tezzeret the Seeker can search for artifacts and put them into play. And then we have that here too. Finale of Devastation. Transmute Artifact allows us to, I mean, this is nonsensical text, but that's the reserve list. I can't help you. Basically, this is a way to go get Basalt Monolith or our Mirage Mirror, some way to fix our mana colors, because that's a lot of what Kinnan is about, right? We get infinite mana with the Basalt Monolith, but we don't get infinite colored mana, so we can't infinitely activate Kinnan. So we either need a way to win the game with infinite colorless mana, which can be pumping it into Thrasios or casting a very big Finale of Devastation with enough creatures in play, or we need a way to convert our colors so that we get blue-green and we can activate Kinnan, put all our creatures into play, including Thrasios, get the rest of our deck, and we can win pretty easily from there. And the other artifact that we use to win is Mirage Mirror, which is 3 mana. You can spend 2 to have it become a copy of target artifact, creature, enchantment, or land until end of turn. I explain this combo line in my combo guide that you can check out. The short way that this works is that you're going to make infinite colorless mana with Basalt Monolith. You're then going to put some large amount of Mirage Mirror activations on the stack. You have to hold priority on these because Mirage Mirror, once it becomes a thing, is just that thing, is if there's not another ability of it on there on the stack. We're going to have Mirage Mirror target a Basalt Monolith and a land, and we're going to alternate those so that what we can do is have it become a land, tap for green, have it become a Basalt Monolith, untap it with our colorless mana, and then let the triggers resolve, alternating these two, where we get green and blue mana, and we spend our mana untapping it. It sounds a little convoluted, but it's actually pretty straightforward. I have like a full animation of it in my combo guide that you can check out, but it is fairly straightforward. Just Basalt, Mirage Mirror, land, alternate, tap, untap. Okay, Fabricate, another way for us to find artifacts. So we're going to have ways to tutor, but also this is kind of a control deck. So this deck tends to try not to die. You're going to run things like Dispel as more counter magic, Rapid Hybridization to kill things, Mana Drain, more free interaction like Misdirection and Commandeer, which we're going to use to be able to interact with our opponents until we can get into an overwhelming position in a mid-range kind of game. This is a kind of mid-game or late-game deck. The longer the game goes, the better we are. So we want to try not to die, use our advantage if we have an early one, but typically set ourselves into a position where we just can't really be beat and our opponents are just grinded out of the game. We also have access to the Retraction Helix to do that combo with the Value Flood Caller we mentioned. Dramatic Reversal we're starting to see pop up in more Kinnan decks. We don't have the Isochron Scepter in this deck to go infinite mana with it, but we can a whole lot of mana with Kinnan with this card. It's just a big ritual. And then, like I mentioned, bunch of interaction. Forces, Fierce, Court of Calling's a tutor. MBT, Commandeer is kind of starting to become pretty popular in Kinnan's to be able to take other people's heuristic studies, things like that. Artifacts, a whole bunch of ways to tap for mana, and then those combo pieces we mentioned, as well as the One Ring. Moonsilver Key is a tutor. Lets you search your library for an artifact card with a mana ability or a basic land. Typically, it's going to find Basalt Monolith. And then some of these aren't the most common. These are starting to become more popular in the format in general, but specifically in Kinnan. Copy Artifact. Somebody else has a Basalt. You can use that to potentially win, or just get your own like 2 mana, the One Ring. Steal Enchantment, you can use to take somebody else's Heuristic, Mystic, or their Necropotence. Copy Enchantment, copy those things. Mirror Maid can enter as a copy of an artifact or enchantment. You start to see like less creature clones in our format and more artifact enchantment clones because these are the value engines that the game is about. And then Heuristic Study, Mystic, Lemora, you should expect to see these in every single deck. And then lands, we're only on 26. We run a few more utility lands because we're only in 2 colors, so there's not as much of a cost for that. Cephalid Coliseum, you will see used to potentially make people draw themselves out to death by, like, if they exile their whole deck and cast Thassa's Oracle, make them draw their deck, they lose the game. You can also use it to loop with Endurance to kill people at instant speed. That line is a little convoluted for this video, but know that you can do Endurance loops with Cephalid Coliseum to be able to mill out your opponents and kill them all at instant speed very safely. Manamo is an interesting one that has become pretty popular for the same reason that you might have seen it in formats like Modern, because you can use it to untap the One Ring, and in these kind of decks you can also use it to untap your Gaia's Cradle. And then Treasure Vault is a land that you can spend XX to tap, sacrifice it, make X treasure tokens. If you get infinite mana with Basalt Monolith, you can use this to make infinite treasures. So then you've mana fixed and you can activate Kinnan to win the game. Kinnan is kind of a big flips, kind of stompy deck. In a way, it can be played that way. Sometimes it will play very reactive. Sometimes it will have to mulligan kind of aggressively to find hands that are keepable where you have enough mana sources and a way to not die or a way to find a win. Typically, again, you're going to kind of prioritize developing mana, getting Kinnan into play, not dying, and getting into a overwhelming position where you get that Seedborn Muse in play, that Wandering Archaic, Sphinx, whatever it takes, and then keep people from being able to do the thing and stop them. Sometimes you'll see more stacks effects like Void Winnower in this kind of deck. If the creatures characters that you're seeing right here appeal to you, this might be the deck for you. It is very popular, especially among new cEDH players. It is actually pretty hard to play at a high level. It is very easy to understand the basics of it though, and understand the appeal, I think, especially. So if you like it, it's worth picking up and sticking with. Just know that just because you beat your friends up with it, it doesn't mean you're going to be able to easily spike a tournament. It's actually very hard to play. All right, next up, we're taking a look at Sisay, Weatherlight Captain, which is a 5-color commander. Sisay is 2 and a white. It gets +1/+1 for each color among other legendary permanents you control, and it's by default a 2/2. And then you can spend Wooburg to search your library for a legendary permanent card with a converted mana cost less than Sisay's power. Put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Sisay is a 2/2. You activate her, you can search for something that costs 1 or less that's a legend. Put it into play. If Sisay is a 7/7, you can search for 6 or less. However big she is, you get 1 less than that. This is a deck that changed quite a bit with the banning of Dockside Extortionist. Before the bans, it was pretty common that that was the main card this deck prioritized, and it wasn't that uncommon that once they resolved Dockside Extortionist, they just won the game. Because they would be able to, if Sisay is large enough, chain tutor effects and the ability to blink or make copies of Dockside, so that way they could just make more Sisay activations and just turn one activation into a win. Sisay is sort of known for Planeswalker chains and the Planeswalker combos that it enables. This is probably the deck this time that we're going to discuss that has the most niche sort of combo application. A lot of these are still relevant the last time I covered this, other than any mention of me saying Dockside Extortionist or Jewel Lotus. So anything I don't cover here may be covered in the 2024 guide. You could check that out too if you want to learn more about Sisay. Sisay is just a deck that has a ton of flexibility. It's going to be hard to exhaustively cover everything about the deck in every line because there's just a billion of them, and also can depend on some niche cards that you might choose to run. Typically, Sisay is looking to get down a way to tap for all 5 mana or net activations in some way. Very commonly, that's a card like Bloom Tender. It can be Gigantha, which taps for all 5 colors. It could be Silvala. It could be Derevi if you have like a Gaia's Cradle and a way to mana fix like Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which the card we'll talk about. It can be a lot of different ways. Eorith, there's a lot of overlap to potentially get the mana to activate Sisay. And then typically what you'll do is get that one activation, like let's say we use it, activate Bloom Tender, make 5 mana, activate Sisay. We could go and then get a Saheeli Rai, which main ability it has is -2, make a token that's a copy of a creature. It comes in with haste, you exile it in a turn. We go get a Saheeli. Let's say our Sisay was 4 before, we needed blue, now Sisay goes up to 5. Saheeli comes in, make another Bloom Tender, activate Bloom Tender. We get another search, go get Tyvar. Tyvar has 3 really relevant abilities. You can activate abilities of creatures as though they had haste. +1 to untap a creature, -2 to mill, and return a creature with 2 or less, mana value 2 or less to the battlefield. We could get Tyvar, untap that Bloom Tender, tap it again. We've got our Sisay even bigger. Now we could get Amanatu, which can come in, flicker that Bloom Tender. That Bloom Tender may tap as though it had haste because of Tyvar, so now we can activate again. Then we could get Nicol Bolas. Depending on the cards that you have access to, the mana you have available, these change could look different. The order you do them in might be different. There's a whole lot of different factors that can go into it. The main sort of combo that the deck is known for that we're trying to enable is Amanatu, the Fate Shifter, Nicol Bolas, Dragon God, and Oath of Teferi. Which the main thing that this does is allow you to activate loyalty abilities of Planeswalkers twice a turn. That's the shortcut, so I don't have to look at all 3 of these cards. So if we have those 3 cards into play, which like I mentioned, we can do these things to very easily assemble that because they're all legends we can put into play. So what we're going to do is use Amanatu to flicker whatever we're using to make mana. And then we can use Nicol Bolas twice to do any of these abilities, like flicker 2 permanents. And then we can activate them to start flickering each other. So we can start flickering things and these Planeswalkers infinitely. But kind of the clean way we have to win, or one of the cleanest ways we have to win, is netting infinite mana, and then we can get Mount Doom, tap it, deal 1 damage to each opponent, flicker things, untap it. We can do this with Derevi as well to untap whatever. There's lots of ways to get people dead once you do this. You can also even just like start plussing Saheeli Rai eventually. But that's the main thing we're assembling, is this sort of Planeswalker combo. But what the deck is known for is the kind of chain leading up to that. So we kind of mentioned getting a Bloom Tender and chaining our way there, but we might want to use Sisay to go get something that's a little more value oriented or can help set us up. Like Sisay can tutor for Asika, which it itself is a mana dork, and it makes all our other legends mana dorks. So we can really pump our mana production up quite a bit just with 1 search. So you're going to see kind of 5-color good stuff-ish creatures like mana dorks, the engines we talked about, Esper Sentinel, Ragavan, and then there's going to be a prioritization of legendary creatures that are generically good or otherwise combo, for like Kinnan, Lotho. Derevi is a staple of this deck. Selvala is a pretty big staple. Giganta is starting to become one. Giganta can tap for a Wooburg, and which can be spent to pay generic mana costs. Pumping it into Sisay is perfect for that. And so we have this sort of overlap of utility pieces, like we can tutor for an Urtai to interact at instant speed. Some of the planeswalkers that you'll see in some decks will also be able to even do things at instant speed. Like if you have somebody who plays Ashiok or Narset, they could potentially tutor for things to disrupt their opponents. And then untapper effects, things that are disruptive to our opponents, like Feldia you can use to flicker an opponent's opposition agent, which is a major weakness to this deck. Some other combos you can do for infinite mana in this deck are using Derevi with Emil. You can use that along with Gaia's Cradle, or something else that taps for 3 or more mana. Emil, flicker, Derevi ETB, untap something that taps for more than 3 mana. Start to net infinite mana, you can start color fixing and then win the game pretty easily. Again, if you start to have haste enablers in play, like the Tyvar, all this stuff starts to overlap to be much easier to do with things like Selvala. But essentially, you are chaining together legendary creatures in a way that gets Sisay bigger as it goes, so that you can eventually, with 1 activation or 2, assemble a chain of tutors that will win you the game. Seaborn Muse has started to become more popular in Sisay decks because it's less just about cast Dockside, activate, win the game, and it might be more of a series of chains. And the more big tappers you have, the better and easier this gets to be. Sorceries, they tend not to run very many, just a couple tutors. You might see a Finale of Devastation, Demonic Tutor, and that's it. It can depend, usually as many as 4, often less than that. Sisays don't tend to interact on the stack that much with actual spells. They really want to keep opposition agents out of play. So you have things like Strict Serenade to counter those, Abrupt Decay to blow them up, Deadly Rollick. You see there's no forces. We're not that blue heavy. And again, we're not really trying to counter our opponent's win attempts. We're kind of trying to keep them off balance. You might see some stacks type effects in these decks as well, and work our way towards a win with Sisay. They can be known to be kind of greedy, but they have enough interaction and they can prioritize it with their mulligans depending on the pod. Artifacts, a lot of stapley stuff that we expect, and then a couple that are unique to this deck or other similar decks. Agatha's Soul Cauldron has a lot of text and it's just a really ridiculous magic card. Notable things that it does is it color fixes for Sisay, so you can spend manas over mana of any color to activate abilities, so you can just tap Gaia's Cradle for green, activate Sisay. That's already pretty good. Creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them have activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, and that lines up with its other ability, which is tap, exile card from a graveyard. When a creature card is exiled this way, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. If your Bloom Tender dies or any of your other mana dorks, you can tap Soul Cauldron to exile them and then make another creature have that ability. Marvin Murderous Mimic is kind of like this too. It's a new staple in these decks. So it has all activated abilities of creatures that aren't Marvin. If you have a Bloom Tender, he's also a Bloom Tender, or whatever creature it might be. Agatha's does a lot of things for us, where it is graveyard hate. It lets us sort of buy back effects from our graveyard, things that might get killed. Like, for instance, we mentioned Orcish Bowmasters can blow out these dorks very easily, turn our other creatures into mana dorks. Could have something happen where like Gigantha gets wheeled, you activate Sisay, tutor up Soul Cauldron, which is a legend, put it into play, and then now your Esper Sentinel is a Gigantha, and you can probably win the game. Relic of Legends, we run lots of legends. This can tap them down to make mana. And then Chromatic Orrery, some of them run this card, some don't. Color fixes, as well as taps for 5 colorless. Get your Sisay big enough, use this with untap effects. You can net infinite mana and start drawing cards as well. It's just a pretty powerful card. And again, it's a legend. Enchantments, this is where you might see a couple flex slots. Carpet of Flowers hasn't been the most popular, but starts to be, it's starting to be more popular. Cultist of the Absolute gives your commander +3/+3, flying death touch ward, pay 3 life, beginning of your upkeep, sack a creature. This on its own makes Sisay 4 bigger. This on its own often just jumps Sisay to be big enough to where if you have enough mana, you just win the game. Mystic Ristic are in every deck. Smothering Tithe, pretty much in every white deck at this point. We mentioned the Oath of Teferi as a combo piece, and then Touch the Spirit Realm is an uncounterable way to flicker something. It won't come back till end of turn, so you exile like an opposition agent and you can win the game. Use this on an end step going into your turn. Channel abilities are very powerful. And then lands, pretty much just the 5-color mana base. We mentioned the Gaia's Cradle. We have lots of creatures. We have mana fixing. Mount Doom is the way that we can win the game, get infinite mana. We can do this at instant speed often as well. And then Otawara, Beseiju, just too broken not to run basically. Sisay is really the sort of toolbox deck of the format. It often has really kind of fun lines to go through and it's a puzzle to put together. What you kind of tool your deck to beat can often decide whether you get to win a matchup, because every slot in this deck matters a ton because you have so much ability to tutor for things. Every little piece that you decide to put in the deck can really have a major impact. It is a really cool deck, been very powerful. It was expected to get worse post-ban, but I think it was really just, it has less explosive potential without Dockside. In general though, totally still works. You have so many different ways to tap for Wooburg, so it is still definitely a really powerful deck. The combo lines are simple enough, I think, for people to pick up reasonably, but it is one of those decks that you really just want to get lots and lots of reps on because it absolutely rewards experience with it beyond everything else. Next up, we have Najeela, which is going to be sort of representative of 5-color good stuff in the format in general. Whether it'll be this deck that's the most popular or a couple other ones, that's hard to say. Sisay doesn't really occupy the same spot because it is so synergistically built around Sisay. Kinrith previously, before the bans, was a pretty popular 5-color deck, but it was pretty built upon Dockside Extortionist as a main thing that kept that deck together, and it's not doing as well post-bans. We did just see a Sika do very well. You could look at that deck in my top 16 breakdown of the Boil if you wanted to hear about that one. I think Najeela is the one you should expect to be the most popular. Also basically represents all of what 5-color good stuff piles look like, on top of also having a few combos that, along with its popularity, you're going to want to know how they work and what to expect out of them. So that's what I'm covering Najeela here. Najeela, 1 is a pretty cheap commander at 3 mana. So you can, depending on the build of Najeela, just run it as a 5-color commander that's pretty cheap and has relevant text and some combos that go with it. Don't even have to worry about anything else. It's just 5-color good stuff, but it does have very relevant text on it. So Najeela is a warrior. Whenever a warrior attacks, you may have its controller create a 1/1 white warrior creature token that's tapped and attacking. So when Najeela attacks, you make a 1/1. Next turn, you attack with both of those. You make 2 1/1s, etc. You start doubling and doubling and doubling. You see how they get out of hand. And you can spend Wooburg to untap all attacking creatures. They gain trample, lifelink, and haste until end of turn. After this phase, there is an additional combat phase. Activate this ability only during combat. What you can do is, if you're able to get infinite mana some way, we'll talk about some ways to do that, you can attack with Najeela, activate Najeela, get an extra combat where you're going to be netting more and more warriors every single time. And if you're able to keep hitting people, keep getting the damage in, everybody dies because you're going to get even more warriors. You're going to keep doubling and doubling and doubling, get everybody dead. It's a couple cards that combo with Najeela specifically to do that. As we see them now, it's mainly the 2 creatures that people run. There's other things like Druid's Repository, a couple other ones you can run, but mainly we see Derevi, which has, when it enters or a creature you control with combat damage to a player, you untap a permanent or tap a permanent. So whenever a warrior hits somebody, untap a land, if you get 5 hits in or you have the mana to get it going, once you get enough warriors, you're able to just untap enough lands or put all the triggers on like a command tower, for instance. Tap that mana down, activate Najeela, go infinite. And then Grim Hireling, which is whenever 1 or more creatures you control do combat damage to a player, create 2 treasure tokens. This has like the Tymna text, meaning it can only trigger once for each of your opponents. So you can get up to 6 treasures. You're either going to get 0, 2, 4, or 6 treasures. If you can hit all of your opponents, then you're going to be able to get 6 treasures. Activate Najeela, go infinite. The only other Najeela specific card really in terms of creatures is Samut, which is a warrior itself for 3 mana, and it has first strike, vigilance, and haste. Whenever a creature you control does combat damage to a player, if that creature entered the battlefield this turn, draw a card. So Samut itself has haste. When it attacks the first time and does combat damage, you're going to get to draw a card, but also it will trigger off of every warrior Najeela makes. This can be incredibly overwhelming. That is a lot of card draw. If you have even a half decent amount of warriors in play, that will start drawing an insane amount of cards, and it's only going to get worse as the game goes on. So it's really just these 3 in terms of here to combo with Najeela. The rest are pretty good cards that we've already looked at, like the sort of best dorks that tap for the most colors with these 5. Esper was a value engine. We mentioned Lotho, Abolisher, Bowmaster's Thassa's Oracle. Tinderwall is a sort of a dork. It's 1 green. You can sacrifice it to add 2 red, so it can help you get out early Najeelas or just power out early cards in general. Convert early green into red, kind of do some explosive things with that. Helps with your ad nauseas, stuff like that. But yeah, just basically mana, silence effects, our combo pieces, and then Samut to draw some cards. Another one that you will often see is Kutzel. Pretty popular, not in 100% of Najeelas, but probably something like 90 at this point. It's a warrior itself with that Grand Abolisher effect. We looked at it in TNT earlier. Sorceries here, we've got a lot of the ones we've already seen, right? Rite of Flame, Imp Seal, Gamble, Tutors, creature tutors, that culling ritual. We're 5 colors, so we get access to all of these good cards we've been talking about. We got the good TNT cards like Culling Rite and Eldritch Evolution. We got the Savine's Wreck because we get to run Intuition and Underworld Breach. The only kind of surprising include here is Green Sun Zenith. Typically, you'll see this card along with Summoner's Pact because the deck has the overlap of get an early Mana Dork, get a Tinderwall potentially, get a Samut, get a Derevi. So you have lots of utility. And if you throw in Cutzel in there as well, you have another green card that is just, it basically covers every base possible. But yeah, when you're in 5 colors, you have access to really good cards. Summoner's Pact goes with that package as well. Again, a little surprised not to see the Cutzel, but you can run it. You don't have to. It's pretty good though. Lots of these cards. Again, we're going to see the best cards that we've been seeing. A couple that we haven't looked at yet. I don't think I've talked about it, but the Red Blast, we've talked about how blue this format is, so it's pretty common. You will see these cards. Veil of Summer kind of works as a silence effect, making your spells uncounterable till end of turn. Can also be really good against things like Orcish Bowmasters or bounce spells that might be trying to disrupt you. Eladamri's Call is an instant. That's a straight-to-hand tutor for creatures. This good stuff I was talking about. Brain Freeze for our Breach. We got the Tainted Pact. We got the Demonic Consultation for Thras' Oracle. Got Intuition for that Breach. We get to run Ad Nauseam. We're not the fastest Ad Nauseam deck in the world. We do run a decent amount of rituals with the Culling Ritual, Dark Writ. This one not on Cabal Ritual, but we do have that Rite of Flame and that Tinderwall, which I'll count too. Really help us kind of power that Naz out. We're decently focused on getting our commander into play, enabling Deflecting Spot and Fierce Guardianship. Very, very helpful. Very, very good in this format. Artifacts, not too heavy on them. You will occasionally, pretty rarely, but occasionally see One Ring in Najeela. Typically, it's going to look something like this with the best fast mana, the 2 5-color-ish rocks, with Felwarstone kind of being a 5-color rock, and then Wishclaw Talisman. You can kind of do this to taste, but this is typically what it looks like. Notably, Mox Opal is a card that has gotten a decent bit worse with the banning of Dockside and Mana Crypt. You just have less artifacts in play on average. Enchantments, no Smothering Tithe or Necropotence here. Sometimes you'll see the Tithe, not too common you'll see the Necro, but on occasion. Mystic Rhystic Breach, though, should expect them to be here basically always. And then lands, we're just going to have amazing 5-color mana base. We do get cards like City of Traders that not every deck runs. Decks that are trying to go a little bit faster, close the game out quickly, will run this. We saw it in Rogsai as well. You have to sacrifice it when you play a land after it. So as your first land, it's often not that great unless you're really trying to close the game out early. And then the rest is just 5 colors. We do have Tarnished Citadel, which can tap for colorless or deal 3 damage to yourself for a rainbow land. You kind of do whatever you can to cast your spells in these kind of decks because that's the main cost of 5 colors. That will be your biggest issue, and a lot of times is just how flexible your deck is and how to cast your spells, because the 5-color mana base will be fighting you at times, especially if you're not really like planning your turns out in advance with how you fetch and really trying to get that sequencing down. But Najeela is one of the most popular commanders, has been historically a powerhouse in the format, even though it's been a little bit lessened lately. If you're wanting to do just the best cards, don't have to worry about picking and choosing, don't want to have to leave anything, build the deck exactly with what you want with all your favorite cards, this is the deck to do it probably. 5-color Najeela just offers pretty much everything you could want. You don't want to do the creature combat beats, you don't have to, but it does represent a consistent game plan that in the long game will eventually kill the table if Najeela is not disrupted. And then again, they have just those easy 1-2 punches with their commander that just closes the game out immediately. Very powerful deck, one you have to respect and understand the lines for, understand the numbers and what colors they have access to, which can often trick them up if they're going for a Derevi line or if they can't quite get through with Grim Hireling. But yeah, Najeela, one of the decks to beat at the moment. So I was kind of surprised to see how popular Rog Thras has gotten, but we're going to be talking about it this time and moving Magda to the next kind of part 2 of this, because I think that'll tie in better to some of the other decks that we're looking at there. We can kind of group them together better. Whereas Rog Thras kind of toes the line between tutor chain sort of things that Sisay does, as well as the like toolboxy nature of that kind of deck. And then there's a little bit of the Rogsai thing, whatever. But again, we're going to be covering a bunch more decks. Let me know down below what decks you want to hear about in the next episode before I record that one. This time we're looking at my Rog Thras build. There are a couple different ones you can take a look at. The Boil 2 had a pretty different Rog Thras build I just went in detail on this past week. So you can check that one out as well if you want a pretty different look. My build is pretty much what you would call the bouncy house build. That's sort of the default of a lot of what Rog Thras looks like right now, with a couple changes I'll mention. We've talked about both of these commanders so far. Rograk enables free stuff. He's just a body in play. It's a commander. It's a legendary creature. You get rewarded for all these things, for all the reasons we mentioned with Rogsai, with a couple differences here. And Thrasios, again, is another cheap commander, which is good too for getting bodies into play, is a decent engine if you can generate lots of mana, and is an outlet if you can generate infinite mana to just very cleanly, consistently, I got infinite mana, I win the game. What this pairing does together is enable a very creature-centric sort of game plan that overlap in a synergistic sort of way that not a lot of partner pairings have. So this build is kind of defined by a few different cards, namely Gaia's Cradle, because we have two very cheap commanders and lots of other cheap creatures we run. Gaia's Cradle is always online turn 1 with Rograk in play, and it's very often you also cast the turn 1 Thrasios along with him. And again, we have all these other cheap, or with cards like Cloud of Fairies, even free creatures, depending on other things we have too, where we have so much overlap, we can get creatures into play for basically nothing or even net mana while we do it. And these all just line up and work well together to support each other, where we get our Gaia's Cradle is always online and we get lots of cheap creatures in play. So our Gaia's Cradle gets better very, very quickly. And we run lots of untap effects and lots of ways to find it. So we're really a Gaia's Cradle and infinite mana kind of style deck. And those two things overlap because the reason this deck is called Bouncy House is because we often combo by bouncing something infinitely and replaying it to net mana, usually enabled by Rograk, and can work with cards like Cloud of Fairies, which when it enters untaps 2 lands. And the main enabler for that is Cloudstone Curio, which is sort of a defining card of this archetype, which is when a non-artifact permanent enters the battlefield under your control, you may return another permanent you control that shares a permanent type with it to its owner's hand. So what this card means for the base combo, say we have a Gaia's Cradle in play with, 3 or 4 creatures. We have a Cloudstone Curio in play. We can cast our Cloud of Fairies. It's going to enter. We're going to get to untap that Gaia's Cradle and another land, a blue one, to net some mana. And then we're going to return Rograk to our hand, who costs 0. Then we're going to get to recast him, bounce that Cloud of Fairies, rinse and repeat, and start netting infinite mana as we go. Then once we get infinite mana, we can pump it into Thrasios, draw our whole deck, win the game, either with a Finale of Devastation that's infinitely large, or we can use that Cloudstone Curio to do something like bounce our Eternal Witness over and over and lightning bolt our opponents to death. And we have lots of other overlapping ways to do this. This is a deck that is built upon netting infinite mana. I used to do it with Dockside Extortionist, which was a thing that had people thinking this deck would be a lot worse post-ban. But this deck is really defined by how much mana it can generate. So that hasn't really been an issue because Dockside was not something we were uniquely doing to generate mana. Everything else was our unique advantage. So basically everyone lost mana production, but this deck lost even less than everyone else. Kind of similar to the deal with Rogsai. But where Rogsai gets kind of temporary mana often with the Dark Ritual, Culling the Weak kind of effects, we're trying to build permanent mana with Gaia's Cradle, Mana Dorks, things like that. Another card we can use to go infinite with Cloudstone Curio is the Blank Goblin, Sticker Goblin, Mind Goblin. I usually just call him Goblin because I think that's a goofily simple name. He uses the sticker mechanic, which is terrible, but basically all you need to know is that with the proper sticker sheet, with this card and Rograk and Cloudstone Curio, you will always net at least 1 red mana, and you will be able to generate infinite red mana with him. We can also do this with some of our other cheap creatures by tapping them down with cards like Relic of Legends. Like say we combo with Tymna, who only costs 1 mana. When we do our Cloudstone Curio bouncing, we can tap these legends down, like Rograk, Thrasios, whatever, while we're bouncing, and the Tymna to net mana while we're bouncing. And we can also do this with Earthcraft, which lets you tap an untapped creature you control to untap target basic land. If we do this with a 1 mana creature like Mana Dork, or a creature that can make more mana to pay for itself like Wall of Roots, which can put a counter on itself to make a green and then tap with Earthcraft to untap a land, we can also bounce and net infinite mana using Rograk. So Rograk is both an enabler of the very busted free spells we talked about in Rogsai, as well as enabling all of our kind of bouncy house shenanigans. We ran a couple Mana Dorks, not too many because Temur doesn't really have the best ones. We don't get any Hierarch effect, Deathrite Shaman, and running a bunch of like 1/1 dorks to tap for green isn't the best into Orcish Bowmasters. We also get to combo with Devoted Druid. We don't use exactly the same cards that Tymna Thrasios does, but it's kind of the same deal. We use it with Machine God's Effigy, which will enter as a non-creature version of Devoted Druid, which can net us infinite blue and green because we can untap itself and it taps for blue as well. This is like a clone that enters as a mana rock. We run Kinnan, sorry for my Japanese one, and then with Basalt Monolith to net infinite mana, same as a lot of those other decks. We can also use Eternal Witness, which when it enters returns a card from your graveyard to your hand. And if we have a bunch of creatures in play, we can use Eternal Witness, getting Snap from our graveyard, which untaps 2 lands and bounce a creature. We can snap our own Eternal Witness, return it to hand, untap that Cradle, play that Eternal Witness, netting mana as we go by replaying Snap and Eternal Witness over and over, bouncing Snap to our hand, bouncing Eternal Witness to our hand, and net infinite mana that way too. So really, all roads in this deck lead to infinite mana, which is also what the Hullbreaker Horror is here for. It isn't in every Rog Thras deck, but I tend to play it. And then a lot of the rest of our deck is just either making mana or finding ways to win the game. So Imperial Recruiter, we don't have access to the best suitors in these colors. We're missing black. So we need a way to find our creatures that we can combo with. Spellseeker will help us find instants and sorceries that we can combo with, like the Snap, or will get us to our tutors that we do have access to. Trophy Mage is one of the key cards in this deck because a lot of those artifacts that I mentioned that we combo with cost 3 mana. So this can get us our Basalt Monolith, our Cloudstone Curo, or our Relic of Legends, all of which can be combo pieces in this deck. Valley Floodcaller is just generically pretty good. There are some builds of Rog Thras that build around this card, running more otters and frogs and bird stuff. I might look into doing some of those builds. I expect at some point I'll get to cover one, and that'll be pretty cool. But it does have a nice synergy with Earthcraft because this untaps itself, and notably Earthcraft gets around Summoning Sickness as well. So this, just every spell you cast, you just untap lands and net mana off of all your spells, which is really awesome. This is the first deck where I get to talk about Displacer Kitten, which before the Dockside ban was a lot more popular as just a really broken card. When you cast a non-creature spell, you get to flicker a non-land permanent you control. It's still about that broken in this deck though, because obviously you can use it with any of your rocks that tap for mana and net mana. Every deck can do that. You can also use it with any of these tutor effects. So I can potentially Spellseeker for a tutor to get Displacer Kitten, cast another spell, flicker Spellseeker, go get another thing to get a combo to go with Displacer Kitten, and just keep chaining. And it also is really broken with Cloud of Fairies once you have a Gaia's Cradle in play. If your thing in this game is you just want to make 1,000,000 mana and figure out a way to win from there, this is the deck to do it, because you can very easily turn 2, turn 3 be making like 8, 12, 16, 20 mana, and you're just activating Thrasios to try to find a win, and he'll get you there. Phyrexian Metamorph we have talked about as a flexible clone at the moment. Sowing Mycospawn is pretty unique to Rog Thras. I've seen some Tevish Thras, other Cradle decks that are really focused on Gaia's Cradle opting to run it. Looking at Rog Thras will also give us an opportunity to look at some of the other new utility lands that a lot of decks are running. But this card is basically just a creature that goes and gets your Gaia's Cradle. If you already have Cradle, it can get Manama or some other flex lands we'll talk about. We are a Thrasios deck, so you can expect Seedborn Muse, and notably, because we make so much mana with things like Gaia's Cradle, Seedborn Muse often just wins the game, basically, immediately. Sorceries, we have just a bunch of tutors, basically. Wheel of Fortune to kind of fuel up. Not every Rog Thras runs it, but you usually see one kind of wheel effect. We use our graveyard a lot more now that we run cards like 6, which lets you retrace cards from your graveyard, so you can pitch a land to cast permanents from your graveyard, which overlaps really well with a lot of what we do because all our win conditions are permanents. And then Malevolent Rumble, which is sort of an impulse effect. You look at the top 4, reveal them, take a permanent card from among them, and then you put the rest into your graveyard and you make an Eldrazi spawn token, which can sack for a colorless. This is one of the goofier cards in this deck, and of a deck that runs goofy cards like Tamiyo, which we kind of run to combo with Earthcraft, and it's just actually a pretty good engine. I think this card is underplayed. Malevolent Rumble actually is here because it allows us to, well, one, it's actually just pretty good. I've been surprised just casting this card. It's pretty good. But 2, we can, because we make a spawn token with it and we're milling over 4 cards, really this card only costs us the green every time we cast it. So if we have something like an Earthcraft in play, we can tap that spawn down to untap a forest and make it mana neutral. With that, while we're milling cards, we got a mana neutral way to mill our deck and potentially mana positive way to mill our deck. We can run Underworld Breach without having to run Lion's Eye Diamond or Brain Freeze, which tend to be like the worst cards in that combo, and we can just run Breach as a good card that has some overlap with cards that we just want to run, like Earthcraft, which not a lot of decks run, but when you have 2 commanders in the zone that cost 2 mana total, your commanders are mana neutral to play. And then any other creature you play, you can just tap it down immediately and start making mana. Along with these land enchantment effects that make your basic land tap for more mana, it can get really wild. In the instance, we're pretty greedy, at least my build is, and we are really trying to jam wins and net lots of mana and keep jamming more win attempts. So we don't run a ton of counter spells. Like I don't run either the Red Blast or Swan Songs. You will see cards like Flare of Denial, which don't get to see play in too many decks because we have lots of green creatures lying around and it's just pretty good with Thrasios. Flare of Duplication because we are a Roger deck. And because we're a Roger deck, we have access to Deflecting Spot and Fierce Guardianship basically always, the entire game. We don't really sacrifice our Roger, so unless someone else kills him, these cards are online 100% of the time. We've mentioned Crop Rotation as a way to go get some of those utility lands. In this deck, it usually gets Gaia's Cradle, but we'll talk about some other options you can get. Lightning Bolt's a way to kill people. And the rest of these cards we have talked about is just good cEDH cards. There's no Force of Negation here or no Swan Song. Proactive decks can tend to leave some of those out. Here we're just kind of opting for different things like the Flare, like I mentioned, Veil of Summer. Intuition is often more for value in this deck than some of the other decks because we don't have something like Savine's Wreck, but you can Intuition for something like Eternal Witness, 6, and Underworld Breach to get access to the breach, or Shifting Woodland, which is another one of those really powerful utility lands we'll get to talk about that this deck gets to run. Artifacts, we run a decent amount. All the fast mana. We run Expedition Map to find Cradle. Expedition Map is really nice too because it's one of the few land tutors that you can use at instant speed to find Boseiju or Otawara. So you can hold those effects up to be able to Grand Bosch on the stack, tutor for Otawara, bounce it to hand. Very, very nifty card. And again, it's basically been a neutral a lot of times or positive with Gaia's Cradle. This deck does run Candelabra of Tawnos, which is X tap, untap X lands. It is a very expensive magic card. Don't go buy one probably, but it is very, very powerful with Gaia's Cradle and something like Manamo. Any of our lands that are tapping for multiple mana, it just doesn't seem that good, but it's very broken and you can start flickering it with Kitten and it gets even more broken. We got some of the other Rogue Rack kind of powerful cards, right? Mox Amber, Springleaf Drum. And then a new addition that is in some cEDH lists, but not all of them, is Vexing Bauble, which is 1 mana. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. So like if you cast a Mox Amber, countered. Cast a Force of Will, countered. You have to spend mana on your spells or they get countered. And then it has 1 mana, tap, sacrifice it, draw a card. So that way you're not stuck with this thing in play, which is really nice in multiplayer where you could play this when you don't have any free interaction and your opponent can just be like, hey, I got this Fierce Guardianship. Can you crack your bauble so I can use it? And you can make sure you guys don't die to the combo player. Mana production stuff, the Signet, the Grim Monolith, and then we mentioned all these combo pieces. Basalt with Kinnan, Cloudstone Curio with a whole lot of things. Relic of Legends can be a combo piece with Cloudstone, but is also just broken in this deck. If you get to cast this thing turn 1, Relic taps for 1, Roger now taps for 1, you get a free Thrasios who holds up a mana at the end. This thing gets your mana production through the roof very quickly. Machine God's Effigy, which is a clone that combos with Devoted Druid, turns it into a rock, can just be pretty good on some other cards too. And then the One Ring. We're a Seedborn Muse deck, we're a Manamo deck. Everything you kind of can run to break the One Ring, we're running it. So it's a card to think about. And it's just pretty powerful. Enchantments, we got the Mystic, the Rhystic, and the Breach that we've talked about. Utopia Sprawl and Wild Growth, you would usually see at least one of these effects, sometimes 2, sometimes I've seen as much as 4, because we're untapping our lands with, we use it with Earthcraft, it gets even better. Right now, these effects are just punished way less than Mana Dorks are and are arguably preferable to them. And then Steel Enchantment, this is an effect that we saw a lot earlier. This can just be another way to get access to those draw engines while also denying your opponents them. It's sort of a reactive and proactive card where you just get the best out of, resolving something like this. And then lands. This is where the deck can get pretty interesting. I mentioned we've got that Manamo to untap the Cradle. Cradle being the definitive card of this deck. We run 2 basics to go with that Earthcraft. The Emergent Zone we talked about to enable instant speed wins with crop rotation. A couple notable utility lands you might see in some cEDH lists. Shifting Woodland enters battlefield tapped unless you draw a force. You tap to add green. It has Delirium, 2 green. It becomes a copy of target permanent card in your graveyard until end of turn, which means you can only activate it if you have 4 more card types among cards in your graveyard. This is one of the craziest cards in this deck. So it doesn't have to tap to activate any permanent in our graveyard. It can be a land, it can be an artifact, enchantment, whatever. I've used it as an Underworld Breach. I've used it as Earthcraft, Cloudstone Curio, Basalt Monolith, whatever. Any combo piece, which all of ours are permanents, you can just copy. It is very nuts. It is very hard to interact with, being the activated ability of a land. It is an incredibly powerful card that has a ton of utility. In our utility lands, we also have Urza Saga, which you're probably more familiar with. Can go and get us an artifact. This can get our Candle, a Soul Ring, our Vexing Bauble. You can use it to make a construct, to make a creature, which can be kind of relevant in longer Cradle games, but not as often. But it's just a pretty decent land in this deck. And then Talongate's Madar is a ridiculous magic card. ETB, phase out a target creature on your land drop. Okay. Tap to add colorless. 1 tap, you can filter for any mana. And then you can spend 4 and just put it into play from your hand. You don't even have to play it as a land drop. You can just spend the mana, hold up a Thrasios activation, and if you need to, just instead of Thrasios, spend 4, activate ability of a card in your hand, put a land into play. It is absolutely wild. Between this, Shifting Woodland, Cradle, E-Zone, Manamo, there's a ton of things you can do with crop rotation in this deck. In general, decks are really heavily incentivized to run a crop rotation package now when you have wild lands like this, with specifically E-Zone and Talongates being so useful in any kind of deck. If you like big mana, if you like going crazy, 20 mana on turn 3, get your Hullbreaker. You can run a Taliga in this kind of deck. Going bigger than everyone else is what this deck does. If that appeals to you, then it's going to be a fun time for you. There's lots of other builds you can look at too that are a little more stormy or do the otter stuff. You can look into that. If you want to do big Gaia's Cradle shenanigans with this deck and find the line, have lots of really cool sequencing decisions you have to make. This is one of the coolest cEDH decks you can play. My favorite deck in the format. It's a ton of fun. It's really popular and becoming quite good right now, I think. Let me know down below which of these decks was your favorite, what you're going to be playing going into 2025, and what you want to hear about next. I'm going to be looking to do a follow-up to this fairly soon, so you let me know before I start recording which decks you want to hear me cover. Got a couple I already have in mind, but the rest of it is up to you guys. So if you got a deck you want to learn how to play or get a better understanding of what it looks like in the post-ban meta, let me know down below. With all that being said though, thank you so much for watching. And as always, go play cEDH. Have a good one, everybody.